Order. Sitting is resumed. Our next debate is on housing benefit and disabled people. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caton, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it's also a pleasure to welcome the Minister and to pass on belated congratulations on her appointment. I called for this debate because I wish to raise with the Minister the effect of the changes to housing benefit for people renting in the social rented sector who are deemed as under-occupying a property. And I'd like to thank my constituents John Turner and Matthew Hancock, as well as Karen Armitage of Stafford and Rural Homes, and my colleague Pauline Ingle for raising these matters with me. From April 2013, this year, size criteria for new and existing working age housing benefit claimants will be introduced. These will replicate the size criteria that apply to housing benefit claimants in the private rented sector. The DWP's impact assessment estimates that out of 660,000 claimants affected by the new rules, some 420,000 are disabled. The impact assessment offers the explanation that, and I quote, disabled claimants are on average older than non-disabled claimants. One consequence is that disabled claimants are also less likely to live in households with children. Fewer people living in a household means that large accommodation cannot be justified under the size criteria and housing benefit entitlement is reduced. End of quotation. In the debate on the Welfare Reform Bill last year, I raised the question of disabled people sometimes needing more rooms than provided for by the rules. One family in my constituency, with disabled adults and children, needed separate rooms for the couple and a separate room for one of the children under the age of 10. My right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, gave a clear answer. She said, first, if a disabled person has the need for an overnight carer, additional rooms can be allocated. Indeed, if there are disabled people in the house who require rooms, there will be clear support for them to be able to have those extra rooms. I also raised the question of adaptations, which have sometimes had many thousands of pounds spent on them to enable a disabled person to live in the property. It does not make sense to me or others for people to move from such properties to others which will themselves require costly adaptations. I therefore welcomed the fact that of the additional £30 million per annum being added to the discretionary housing payment scheme by the government from April this year, £25 million is intended to be used, and I quote, specifically to assist those disabled claimants who are in properties where a significant adaptation has been made to cater for their individual needs. I have contacted the two councils in my constituency to ask them how they intend to allocate the additional funding received. Stafford Borough Council has been working with housing associations to identify tenants affected by the new legislation. They will be concentrating their extra funding, which I estimate at some £75,000, on disabled people whose property has been adapted and on foster carers. The support will be for 12 months. South Staffordshire District, which has an additional £64,000 funding, will give short-term support, 1 to 3 months, to disabled people with property adaptations. The support is short-term because the council wishes to assess the situation before it commits to the longer term. Both councils, I have to say, have been proactive in arranging mutual exchanges of properties between those who have spare rooms and those who are overcrowded. They've been therefore doing exactly what the government wishes to encourage. However, both councils face serious shortages of one-bedroom properties for couples or singles, as much of the housing in the area has 2 bedrooms. This brings me to 2 questions which I would like to raise with the Minister. Firstly, can councils be sure that they will continue to receive at least the level of additional funding each year for the DHPs, which has been granted in 2013-14? Given that much of the funding will be for disabled claimants in adapted properties in which they're likely to live for many years, the need for DHPs will continue. And secondly, is the guidance for the assessment of the number of rooms required by disabled people being set out in the terms which the Minister used to me in the House last year? In addition to the case I mentioned above, there are instances where disabled people live perhaps on their own or as a couple in a 2-bedroom property with little or no storage space, in which the second room, often very small, is used to store the equipment, perhaps a wheelchair or mobility scooter, which they need. My understanding of the Minister's comments in the House last year is that the second room should not be counted as a bedroom. The size of the rooms themselves is, of course.
to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's making a compelling case. Some of the individuals affected are severely disabled, and the uncertainty that he's outlined is creating great worry, not just for them, but sometimes for some of the adults who have parents who are concerned about the situation. Isn't it imperative that there be an element of certainty introduced to the system?
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention and agree with him. I think certainty is vital, and that's why I'm asking for clarification, and hopefully clarification in the terms in which my Right Honourable friend, the Minister last year, expressed in the House of Commons, of course.
Oldhouse for pursuing this matter so consistently, and congratulate him on having the benefit of John Turner as a constituent as well, who I know an assiduous campaign on this matter. The other issue is consistency across the country as well. And there needs to be a monitoring by central government of how this policy is being applied. Because I think what we'll discover, as we are discovering in some areas, the inconsistency of approach by individual councils.
I thank the Honourable Member for his interventions. He's right. In the two cases I've outlined of Stafford Borough and South Staffordshire, you can already see some differences there. These are not differences which the councils themselves are doing for ideological reasons. They're because they take a slightly different approach. I'm all in favour of local councils making their own decisions, but I think if we end up where some councils are having drastically different conditions for DHPs to others, there will be serious problems. And of course, I'm going to come on to the question of the different profile of housing stocks in different parts of the country, which has an impact on what the Honourable Gentleman has said. So just to continue, talking about the space, the size of the rooms is also something which needs to be considered. The rules specifically rule this out. A typical tenancy agreement may describe the bedrooms as 2 + 1 + 1, i.e. 1 double and 2 single. They're described as single for a reason. They're often very, very small, as I've seen for myself. Yet a family of, for instance, a couple and 2 boys under the age of 16 would be considered as under-occupying. The rules encourage them to move to a 2-bedroom property, which may itself be described as 2 + 1, and where they would effectively be in breach of the tenancy. Size of rooms is surely something which needs to be taken into account when determining whether there is under-occupancy, and I ask the Minister to reconsider the rules on this. Of course, the family I've just spoken about might not be able to find such a property. The shortage of suitable housing in many areas into which tenants can downsize is a serious problem. It is likely to be the most significant reason why disabled people are by far the most likely to be affected by the changes to the housing benefit rules, given that, as the impact assessment stated, they will tend to be in smaller households. There is nothing that disabled, or indeed anyone affected people, can do about this. They cannot move into properties which do not exist. Of course.
It's an important debate. Obviously, this is a massive issue for disabled families, but also more widely. There's 660,000 people on housing benefit likely to be affected by the changes, mostly from those that live in 2 or 3 bedroom properties who need to move to a 1-bedroom property, being penalised by an average of £728. Does he think it's fair that they're penalised in such a way when there is such a shortage of 1-bedroom households?
I think it's a very difficult situation. I fully understand the government's need to get to grips with Housing Benefit Bill, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, considers these matters extremely carefully, and I've had personal discussions with him on it. And I do agree with the need to try and free up the housing stock, the larger housing stock, for those people who are over-occupying, overcrowded. I have constituents coming to me with that problem as well. But I would agree with the honourable member that there is this problem. So I wish to ask the Minister whether in allocating discretionary housing payments between councils, any allowance has been made for those areas in which there is a short supply of the 1-bed housing and most suited to disabled people living on their own or as couples without the need of a carer. If not, then I believe this needs to be taken into consideration, at least for a period of time, until councils or housing associations have been able to provide such properties. 2 of the reasons for introducing the rules are to encourage greater mobility within the social rented sector and to make better use of the housing sector stock, as I've already mentioned. These are important reasons at a time when families are struggling in overcrowded accommodation, as I'm sure all members will know through their own surgeries. But the problem is in the application for existing tenants who are affected, 2/3 of whom, as we've seen, are disabled. It is difficult to see the purpose in encouraging a family, say with 2 girls, one of whom will be 16 in a year or two, moving away, even if they can find a smaller property, only to need to move back into a larger property when the, when the under-occupancy deduction no longer applies. If family incomes were such that an additional £12 or so a week was affordable, then there would be no cause for concern. But for families in which one person is disabled, income is more than likely to be limited, and the need for a discretionary housing payment therefore grows. It is for such cases as this that I would encourage the Minister to increase the additional funding of the discretionary housing payment. If £25 million is set aside to offset the reduction in housing benefit for disabled people whose homes have been adapted, and that may well in itself be insufficient, then there is very little left for other difficult situations. Turning to another matter, Mr. Caden, a constituent visited me 2 weekends ago to put the case of fathers who live apart from the mother of their children but look after them for, say, 3 nights a week. The bedroom that they have kept for their children is considered spare and hence subject to the reduction in housing benefit. I do not believe that a bedroom which is occupied by one's own children for almost half the week can be described as spare. The fathers therefore face the choice of paying the weekly amount while they're trying to live on JSA or ESA and going into debt, and these are their own words, or not having the children to stay. They have all said they will do the former. They will go into debt rather than not have the children to stay. I do not believe it was the original intention of this matter to force them into such a choice. We must not put obstacles in the way of fathers remaining in touch with their children. I would ask the Minister to look again at the rule which does not count a bedroom used by children for 2 or 3 nights a week as part of the occupancy of the home. Mr. Caton, the Housing Benefit Bill has risen from £11 billion in 2000-2001 to £21 billion in 2010-11. Even in real terms, that is an increase of £6 billion a year. I fully appreciate the need to get a grip on it. But ultimately, it will be growth in the economy, improving incomes, and a massive programme of building social and affordable homes, which I hope that all members will support, which will bring it down. In the meantime, I would ask the Minister to consider seriously the changes in the rules which I proposed in respect of the children of parents living apart and the minimum size of rooms which are expected to accommodate more than one child. I would also ask that the Government ensures that my right honourable friend for Basingstoke's statement that clear support for disabled people to have the rooms they require is properly implemented. At the same time, I would ask her to consider making an additional amount available to local councils' DHP funds. This will give them the opportunity to assist those for whom the additional £12 or so a week, which they cannot avoid due to lack of suitable properties to move into, takes them over a tipping point at which their finances become unmanageable and which potentially leads them towards eviction and homelessness.
It's a pleasure to take part in this debate today on such an important issue, and I congratulate my honourable friend for Stafford for securing this debate today. It's also a pleasure to be serving under your chairmanship today, Mr. Caton. I believe it's the first time, and it's a pleasure to be doing so. There is a considerable interest in both housing benefit and how the benefit system supports disabled people in all parts of the House, as we've heard here today. And it is important that we make time to discuss these issues in detail. Before I address some of the specific issues that have been raised during the debate, I would like to set out our approach to the housing provision for disabled people. As honourable members will be aware, we are in the process of reforming the welfare system, which will result in housing benefit for working age people being replaced by universal credit. Current housing benefit arrangements include specific provisions for disabled people that mirror those in other means-tested benefits. These include, for example, a range of disability premiums, earnings disregards and permitted work rules. Through universal credit, we are simplifying the current arrangements to ensure that disabled people benefit from improved work incentives and a smoother transition into work. My honourable friend is right to point out that the cost of housing benefit has increased by around 50% in real term over the last decade, with expenditure totalling £23 billion in 2011-12. This is simply unaffordable in the current economic climate. To begin to address this, the emergency budget in June 2010 introduced a series of reforms to housing benefit paid to claimants in both the private rented sector and the social rented sector. Starting in April 2011 and finishing last month, we've set in place a series of reforms to local housing allowance, which is the basis for housing benefit awards made to people renting in the private sector. These changes are to exert a downward pressure on rents and introduce fairness into the system by, for example, setting caps for the level of benefit that is paid, ensuring that the benefit system isn't funding accommodation that many hard-working families couldn't afford to live in. While disabled people are not exempt from these reforms, steps have been taken to provide some additional support to minimise any potential adverse impacts on them. My honourable friend also mentions the number of people affected by the social sector size criteria who are disabled, and it is important to stress, however, that this reflects the general proportion of disabled people living in the social sector housing overall. In answer to his question, I can confirm to my honourable friend that the criteria allow for an extra room where a household has an overnight carer. And I'm pleased to also hear that Stafford Council, Borough Council and South Staffordshire District Council have been working proactively with tenants to identify, for example, where they may scope for a mutual exchange. I've had other such reports into the department that people are engaging with this and working directly with tenants. I must also stress that there may be many other options that are open to people, some that they will come to sort of privately from their own circumstances, but this is just a measure of things that people could do, that people are already doing, and that could be that they will move to somewhere smaller. It could be that they find the extra amount of money that is required, and other people have taken in a lodger whereby now we are waiving the income tax from that of up to £4,250 per year, so no tax would be payable on that. And lastly, it's important to note that many people in the private sector where supply is of different sizes, that they could move out of the social sector and they could move into the private sector. So when we're talking about whether there weren't the right number of bedrooms within the social sector, that might well be available in the private sector. I will indeed give way.
Forgive me. Is she seriously suggesting that people who are amongst some of the most vulnerable and poorest people in our communities will be able to find £728 on average in their annual income to try and make up for the deficit in the housing benefit again? Is she seriously suggesting that?
I am not being specific in what people should or shouldn't do. I am saying there are an array of options out there for which somebody will find the best solution for them. I, like the Honourable Member, will have had people come to their surgery and they have said, we have come together as a family and we are working on what is a best solution for everybody. So it's not just the person in isolation, it is the whole family. There are many options available, and again, as we have said, we're living in tough financial times. It's nothing that we are taking on board easily. We just have to look at there being 1 million spare bedrooms in the housing situation as it stands, and yet 250,000 families living in overcrowded houses, and we've got to say, what can we do to support those people? But I will move on a little bit more, and then if the Honourable Member wants to ask a further question, he can, but I'll just proceed a little bit further. But there are always specific cases where these options may not be sensible or appropriate, and that is why we have trebled, I'll say that again, trebled funding for discretionary housing payments to give local authorities more flexibility to help people affected by these changes. And that is a considerable amount, trebled. Overall, discretionary housing payment funding in 2013-14 will total £155 million. While the funding has been allocated to support the bedding in of specific reforms, we have listened to feedback from local authorities and as a result have built in flexibility that will allow authorities to allocate funding based on local needs. This flexibility includes, for example, helping disabled people who have made adaptations to their homes to help them remain there. And as my honourable friend has pointed out, And as I've also said, there will be extra provision for those disabled people who need overnight carers to receive these extra payments for an extra bedroom for a non-residential carer. And as the Honourable Member from Central Glasgow pointed out, there are many kinds of support we are giving, and I think that trebling of that discretionary benefit really does go to support these people most in need. I will go to the member for Glasgow Central first.
Again, she's been very generous. Just on the point of flexibility, is the Minister open to the idea of introducing safeguards for people who can't reasonably move to another local property because of a lack of availability, and they're only sanctioned if they refuse a reasonable request? Is she open to that safeguard?
But what we have said, and you're giving some hypotheticals at the moment, what we've said, and that's why we've put extra discretionary funds in, because those local councils will know exactly who those individuals are. We've put extra money in. We've said there was obviously move between social and private, and within that and the many options that are in place, we believe we will be finding solutions for all cases. I will return now to my honourable friend for Stafford.
I'm most grateful for her answers. Could she give some assurance that this additional discretionary funding, which, as I say, I think we need to look at again as to whether it's adequate, but this additional discretionary funding will be continued through 14, 15, 15, 16, for the reason that I gave, that often these adaptations are such that it's not possible for a disabled person to move in the next year or two. I mean, I've got one constituent who's had £30,000 worth of adaptations made. It does not make any sense for them to move from their property.
Minister.
And my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I will be coming on to that a little bit later, and I will explain in detail what we're doing. My honourable friend also will appreciate that, you know, I cannot make sort of spending commitments into the next Parliament, but I will say this regarding the discretionary housing payment. The government is committed to ensuring that these reforms are well implemented, and we are working closely with local authorities and the LGA each year regarding this payment usage, and as part of the review to these reforms we are taking ongoing feedback, and I would be pleased to pass on the points raised here today and any further evidence that emerges as the reforms are rolled out, and we will continue to monitor and evaluate the impact of these changes. But I would also like to put on the record that a lot of the negative impacts that people suggested and talked about last year in the reforms that were going on, about sort of an explosion of homelessness, about mass migration, they simply have not emerged. So what we're all doing, and we want to make sure happens, is that there is a smooth transition, that it is affordable, and of course there is common sense there. My honourable friend talks about expensive modifications. Of course that must be taken into account, and that is precisely why we have trebled this discretionary fund. We also understand the arguments that we've made for exempting certain categories from the social sector criteria measure. However, we do not believe that a blanket exemptions are the most effective and affordable approach to targeting resources, and allow no room to take account, or no one to take account of local knowledge. We have therefore avoided exemptions where possible and favoured the discretionary housing payment, as local decision makers, we believe, are best placed to make those decisions on the individual circumstances. I will indeed.
Can she foresee circumstances in which someone requires an overnight carer where that person would not be allowed or an extra room within the housing benefit provisions?
That is precisely why we are doing this monitoring, why we are doing this evaluation, and it will go on for 2 years to see what extra support that might be needed. Of course, we're watching and observing what is going on. However, if I'll complete my comments here, we are committed to undertaking, as I say, this independent evaluation of all of the housing reforms. The first report on the private sector is due to be published later this year, and work on evaluating the social sector changes will be implemented in April, with initial findings being available next year. I trust that I have answered many of the questions raised here today. On other specific matters, I will get back to my honourable friend for Stafford 4. But as I said at the start of this, Mr Caton, that this is an important debate. It is important that we do closely monitor this. We are looking at the most vulnerable people in society, and we have a commitment to those people. I will indeed give way.
MacDonald, I'm very grateful. I don't want the minister to sit down thinking there isn't a housing crisis out there. She referred to the predictions around some of the housing benefits haven't come true. They have in my constituency. I've got the worst housing crisis since the Second World War. Nevertheless, she's mentioned monitoring, which I think is absolutely critical. Could you give the assurance then that there will be a publication of that monitoring on a regular basis that the House then can receive and debate? Because I think the honourable member's points that he's raised is absolutely critical now, that we see what's happening on the ground, because a number of local authorities will want to work with government to plan over time a transition, because there will be a number of families where the alternatives of private accommodation isn't available and may not be available for a period of years, or social housing may not be available. So it would be helpful to have the assurance that the monitoring will be published and we'll be able to debate that in the House.
Minister.
The honourable member raises a very good point, and of course we have got to monitor this, and I have confirmation from my colleagues that this monitoring and evaluation will be made public. At the moment, you know, there is much speculation about what might happen, and those are hypotheticals. We don't know about that, but by close monitoring, by putting in this discretionary fund, by working in a common sense way with people on the ground who know best about local needs, I do believe that we can get this right.
Giving way, and I welcome her commitment to monitoring. I think that's extremely important. Could you just say a few words about this question of fathers who unfortunately are separated from the mothers of their children, and where they themselves are not allowed to count the occupancy of perhaps up to 3 nights a week of their children in their home as being part of the occupancy of that home? I think this is a very important point, and it goes to the heart of what I know she and I think all honourable members here feel is it's so important for children to have access to both their parents, and certainly in this case to their fathers, on a regular basis.
Minister.
Again, my honourable friend raises a key question, and, you know, again, at the heart of this, we don't want the children to suffer. The children have got to have what's right for them. But what I can tell you is where the tenant has non-residential children, housing benefit may already be paying for a room for the child or children in the place where they usually reside. It would be a double provision to potentially fund an additional room in both parents' properties. However, again, where there are specific complex cases, which we are talking about here, we believe that discretionary payments are the best way to deal with this. But I'm glad all of these points have been highlighted. All of these points will be closely monitored. And again, thank you for bringing such an important debate to the House.
The question is the sitting be now adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye, or the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.